All right, I'm sitting here with Dr. Matthew Johnson, professor of psychedelics and consciousness at Johns Hopkins University.
Oh, there were the Beatles before and then after they they tried psychedelics, and that was a bit of a shift.
Compassion is not an absence of the truth. It's like a zoomed out vision or a zoomed out version, and you add more things into it, and that's true too. It's just more truth.
This is America. Why does someone have to go to a third world country? Like, we should be taking care of our own with this technology. I never met a single person with any other drug class that said, I used this thing, one time, maybe a few times, and it changed my life for the good.
Welcome to the In Search of More podcast. I am your host, Eli Nash. Join me weekly on my quest for more from myself and more from this world. We'll see you on the other side. All right, I'm sitting here with Dr. Matthew Johnson, professor of psychedelics and consciousness at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome to the In Search of More podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
Grateful to have you here. So talk to me a little bit how you got into this work.
Well, there were some emerging threads. I kind of got interested in psychedelics in my late teenage years, early 20s, when in college, I was starting to study drugs in general. I was in a very behaviorally and biologically focused psychology program. Became very interested in how substances include, everything from caffeine to, nicotine, alcohol, to the illicit drugs, affected people's behavior, how it changed the way they think and feel and behave. And so I delved very deeply into that, and as part of that I learned the history of and this would have been back in the late 1990s, learned the history of psychedelic work, how there was all this legitimate scientific
within the
research. Yeah, in the U.S. and a lot of it in Europe. So Europe and the U.S. were the two
Right.
prime.
There was one country in Europe, I think, which didn't shut down research, right, during that, like the period where these were pushed far underground.
Yeah, so there was some work that continued on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So Czechoslovakia, for example, there were, folks that went further. And so they weren't affected. They went further in time in terms of the exploration when things were shut down.
I'm curious about that. So there was a lot of good scientific research going on then, meaning because today, we have many conversations here about that, are the tremendous benefits certain people have seen from psychedelics for healing, especially, addiction and otherwise, and things that I've spoken about. So this science was being studied in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, and there was some good science, and then there was some wacky science, and then there was some like straight up, evil science. Frankly, I mean, the stuff that the CIA was doing, which was uncovered through the Freedom of Information Act. I mean, dropping LSD to people that were unaware of it, U.S. citizens that were visiting a sex worker, for example, and she was in on it and knew that the feds were looking through a one-way mirror, and just observe, just like some diabolical stuff, crazy. And, investigating it as a potential interrogation agent and incapacitating agent. So there was that, and then Tim Leary kind of caused some controversy at Harvard, and, nothing evil, but, sort of pushing the boundaries of what you should do in research, having the sessions at his home on a Saturday night type of thing, and kind of delved into a cliquey sort of environment at Harvard. Very much became who had, done psychedelics in the Leary lab and who hadn't.
Like a spiritual arrogance.
Yes. And he was a brilliant man, did a lot of great things, but he kind of, in some way, he became the poster child of, hey, look, you can't even trust, legitimate scientists like this guy at Harvard. You can't even trust them to do this safely. But the reality is, I mean, Leary was a wild man before he ever took psychedelics, before he researched psychedelics. I mean, he was kicked out of 2 universities when he was young. I mean, he had that wild streak that made him. That's part of what made him so interesting, and such a fun guy, frankly, from all appearances. But it also gave him a wild streak. But you know, more boring researchers that are, real heroes, and, they've are less remembered by the public, by like folks like Humphrey Osmond and Sidney Cohen and Abram Hoffer. There was all these,
There was
less flamboyant folks that were begging him. It was like, Tim, like, tone it down. You're going to like make this thing blow up. And yeah.
Sure enough, he did.
And then it wasn't just because of him, but again, he became the poster. I think it all would have come to a close had it not been for him. I discovered that history, and there were also, in terms of my interest, there were also just, I met people that used, I saw psychedelics around and the effects, including the older generation. I mean, I was born in 1974, so, I wasn't, I don't have memories from the peak of the psychedelic 60s, but I was, not far after that, and meeting adults that I met, was friends with one individuals that had, taken psychedelics and, after Vietnam, and felt that it had helped him come to some resolution of traumatic material. So I was being exposed, and of course, kids, it's like I saw the psychedelics around, the stories about psychedelics, and coming of that age where you learn about, the world, like just even popular music. It's like, oh yeah, the Beatles, like they really were kind of like, they were kind of a thing. They were like really good. And then, oh, they were the Beatles before and then after they they tried psychedelics, and that was a bit of a shift. And so yeah, it's like,
there are a lot of these
Sgt.
stories
Pepper's, and
even Steve Jobs, they say he credited the creation of Apple to LSD.
Yeah, and you throw that in, of course, in the arts, the music, like the stories are endless. But yeah, in industry and technology, science. I mean, Carey Mullis, who invented PCR, which revolutionized biology. I mean, it was like we could actually study DNA because we could replicate it, because you can't study a single, it's really hard to study a single, molecule.
Right,
and
that's
it's like
a technology that magnifies.
Yeah, it just like replicate this thing, this chain reaction that can create, countless copies of DNA material. And so that revolutionized medicine. And Mullis said that he would not have been able to do that had he not had experiences on psychedelics, just sort of seeing himself in that, the DNA unzippering and kind of riding along the molecule. You step back and you think, oh. And then also, one of the things that stuck out to me was that as you kind of like learning about this, whether it's academically or just in terms of what you're seeing in the world, what you're hearing from friends, I never met a single person with any other drug class that said, I used this thing, one time, maybe a few times, and it changed my life for the good. And you just don't come across, even with cannabis, countless positive, stories where it's helped people. But in terms of any medical, anecdote, no one says, oh, I used it one time 30 years ago and it changed the course and never touched it again. Right. But I can say I'm a better person because of this. And not everyone, most people that try psychedelics have fun, and it's neither life change, altering in the positive or negative direction, but it is surprisingly common. It's not uncommon, I could say, to hear these stories about psychedelics. Folks said, yeah, I did, they'll say they tried LSD one time in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and they're telling you this story decades later and saying, I was like this before, and now I'm like this, and I made this decision in my life because of that. All kinds of things, developing their spirituality in one 100%. Way, shape, or another, deciding to either get away from a certain tradition, or a lot of times like revisiting and finding value in the roots of their tradition that they had come from. All these stories, you don't come across those stories. If there's a story with another type of drug that's permanently altered someone's life, it's almost all from one incident. For the
negative.
It's always for the, you got drunk and you killed someone by accident,
and
driving,
when you started researching this, did you go into it with expecting more positive data to come through when you're researching psychedelics versus some of the other drugs, or you went in kind of looking, hey, I'm researching drugs and I'm researching cocaine and I'm researching LSD and seeing what I find?
I was attracted to these positive, anecdotes. But going in, I certainly wanted to study the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Right.
I mean, because I was also aware of, some people tend to go off the rails, and it's really hard to say whether someone who's done a lot of psychedelics and they're kind of out there, they're maybe manic, or whether they're diagnosable or not, but they're just, you meet some people and you think, wow, they may have done too many psychedelics, but you don't really know is the person, especially when we're talking about really heavy use, someone who's willing to do psychedelics hundreds of times, especially in more of a party kind of setting. They're not, they're probably different from the get-go in terms of that willingness to go down that road.
Right.
Is
So
it
you'd have
that,
to kind of,
or is it that the psychedelics made them?
right. You have to meet them earlier in the process to really know what's going on.
And so it's a chicken and egg question. It's like impossible to tease out. But I suspect that in a causal way, and we've got to dig in with the science to really figure this out, but that psychedelics have caused both good and bad, probably depending on who and the way, most importantly, the way that they've been used. And so it is common for, I know, like a lot of, it's almost like the standard script for psychedelic researchers these days to say they somehow magically ended up doing their first psychedelic study, and they were very skeptical because they were a good hard scientist and they had no clue that it would be so meaningful to people, and then they were just astonished by people saying this was one of the most important experiences of their life. And I just
You have to be under a rock for that.
what's
You have to
that?
be living under a rock for a long time.
Yeah, and so that makes a good story. And so take any story you hear like that with a grain of salt, because it doesn't mean everyone is really paranoid of being the next Tim Leary, and everyone's, where a lot of people are afraid that they might be, viewed as being a user of these substances, and that's why, and so if you said, oh yeah, I suspected psychedelics, could be a benefit to people, they might be seen through that lens. But I mean, come on. I mean, scientists who are studying something, especially with an interest in therapeutics, they're at least starting from a hunch,
Right.
or some threads of evidence of why, why it might be, why it might help people. And you're not biased for, it's about how you do the study. So yeah, I was aware of all these things. And as a psychologist, another thread was that I really got into like the psychology of B.F. Skinner and like basic behavioral psychology as a natural science, which is still, it's not my only lens, but one of my probably my most primary scientific lens, and just looking at the contingencies in the environment and how they shape human behavior. And so with that kind of interest, thinking like, wow, these sound like really powerful behavior change agents. And so that was part of my, interest. And so, yeah, I had heard those stories. Was familiar with the older work on alcoholism from the 60s. That was early, but it looked like it was promising and worthy of follow-up. And then, but the carpet was pulled out for political reasons. So I did suspect that, these psychedelics, if they were harnessed, could be leveraged towards therapeutic aims. They could help people improve their lives.
Was there a cautionary tale now for us? Is there something to learn from what happened in the 70s, where there was a lot of promising research, just like there is today, but then it became, it became illegal and even illegal to study? Is there something we should be doing differently now, or should learn from that time, or was just the zeitgeist with politics that caused that?
No, I think there are lessons still to be drawn in other areas. Areas where, there's a lot, it becomes hyper political. And regardless of the evidence, you're told like this just sends the wrong message. And, hot button topics, I think that's a sign of concern, where even
Is this political today?
I'm sorry?
Is it political today, the conversation?
Psychedelics, I mean, there's plenty of political areas more that I'm thinking of, but psychedelics have, it's certainly political, but in a sense, it's evolved such that it's for example, it's a bipartisan issue. I can't think of,
right,
frankly, one of the most bipartisan issues in in the United States. I mean, it's one of the things. I mean, I've been interviewed by all kinds of media, Fox News, Dan Bongino,
Right.
yeah, Anderson Cooper. On the other hand, it's like I've gotten the same response from every kind of side of the media. It's like, this is fascinating. We're in a mental health crisis. There's all these vets and people with
Right,
depression
with
and
PTSD.
being
It's
helped,
yeah.
and it's like, God bless you, keep up the good work. I mean, that's
Right.
like, and I think it wasn't a surprise to me when when it became public that Rick Perry championed this Texas bill to support
Right.
psychedelic research for veterans. I had heard actually through a conservative a guy who had run super PACs, who had connections in the Republican Party, that there was a lot of interest, including by him. I'd heard that years before. And a lot of these folks are really inspired by the vets that they've met, folks like Navy SEALs and Green Berets that have dealt with their trauma and taken their brothers and sisters down to Peru to partake in ayahuasca, for example, and that have seen their lives transformed, and they're kind of pushing for, this is America. Why does someone have to go to a third world country? Like, we should be taking care of our own with this technology. So it really is a bipartisan issue. And I think the more that it becomes, more that people understand how this works. Like, from a superficial understanding, you might say, oh, this kind of makes things just easy. It's an easy escape. When you really understand how it works, how people are really doing their own heavy lifting, how brutal it can be to go through these experiences, and how you really are taking care of your own garbage. You're cleaning out your own basement. It's like radical self-responsibility seems to emerge. I mean, that speaks to more conservative leaning folks. So there
Right.
really is, the more you delve into it, there's something for everybody. There's, no matter what kind of those kind of basic philosophical inclinations that kind of push someone this side or that side on the political spectrum, there's really something for.
So what are the cautions we should be taking? What should we?
Well, psychedelics are certainly, they're powerful tools, so they have risks. I mean, and the nature of those are, they're multifactorial. I mean, you could
I
have.
meant in terms of possibly going back to what happened in the 70s.
Yeah,
Like
there
it
can be a
becoming illegal again.
backlash.
Right.
In fact, I think it's important to realize that in the early and mid 60s, there was more of a media environment like it is today, where almost every story you see about psychedelics is positive.
Right.
And that
I
was,
didn't know this, but this is my understanding of it.
oh
Yeah.
yeah, it was a really positive media landscape, and within a few years it shifted from, if you're a journalist and everything has to go through the editors and the owners, and you couldn't get a negative story published on psychedelics. And then in like moving to the late 60s and late 60s, and certainly by the early 70s, you couldn't get a positive story published on psychedelics. And the Manson murders were a big kind of inflection point there. He pretty clearly had used LSD to brainwash people to commit these murders and have this evil ideology of a coming race war. And I mean, this was decades before O.J. Simpson. This was the first true crime, sort of like the world, viewing this, trial of this horrific, pop culture, murder. And so it was just on the radar screen for everyone, and LSD played a central role. So it kind of shifted from, oh, yeah, not only these drugs that might make your teenagers wear flowers in their head and act like weirdos and like what, whatever, to, oh, it could actually change them into monsters, murderers. And of course, it was far more complex than that.
Right.
It's like, that was a very special, case, but that potential, is there, depending on, the person and the influence. He was obviously a gifted, if you could use that word, brainwasher,
Right.
Cult leader, type.
So for the average person listening to this, is there a message for us? I think about that all the time because I see the promise. I've seen it in my own life. I've been in recovery from addiction since 2013 around. I was addicted to pornography, prostitutes, strip clubs, like the whole gamut. And I worked my ass off to get sober. I'm talking at times 7 meetings a week, 7 recovery meetings a week, 12-step meetings. And for 6 or 7 years, I was diligently working that path. And then I heard Gabor Mate on a podcast with Tim Ferriss, and he says the number one treatment he's seen for addicts is ayahuasca.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't someone who dabbled in drugs, even alcohol. I didn't drink much. I didn't drug almost at all.
Yeah.
Through my teenage years, just wasn't my life. But when I heard him say that, my ears perked up. And despite the fact that I was sober, I still was working hard at it. There was still obsessive thoughts. There was still a lot of anxiety. There was still multiple meetings a week.
Yeah.
And today, post some ayahuasca journeys and some other psychedelic experiences, I don't go to meetings. I don't have anxiety. I don't struggle. I don't obsess. So I've seen it personally. I guess my question for you is, and this goes hand in hand with what you said, that this isn't people looking to take the easy way out necessarily. It was work. And it's condensed work often, right?
Yeah.
It's taking a lot of work and putting it into a small amount of time. What scientifically, what do you think happened to me or to other people that allowed me to live with more freedom today because of a few of these experiences?
Well, in terms of the brain and behavior, I mean, we're creatures of habit. All animals are creatures of habit necessarily. And we get stuck in ruts. And ruts are important. If we had to kind of face reality de novo at every point, like I wouldn't be able to walk down the stairs, I wouldn't be able to cross the street. You have to sort of go on autopilot with so much of your interaction with the world. And there's a downside to that. We can fall into these suboptimal patterns, such as addictions. And even things where we tell ourselves sometimes for years in a million different ways, God, I gotta stop. I can't do this.
And I did stop, right? So I'm like, I did behaviorally, I stopped.
But it still was
yeah,
you weren't out of it. You were still in terms of the work I've done in terms of psychedelics and addiction formally. Well, I've studied survey work with a lot of different substances, methamphetamine and cocaine and opioids and cannabis and alcohol, tobacco, but in the lab work, I've focused on tobacco addiction, given its prominence, and also was something that hadn't been looked at, and so there was some attraction to that in terms of treatment with psychedelics. But I kind of think of it as really with all addictions, including the so-called behavioral addiction. I mean, it's all behavioral, but the sexual addictions, which frankly aren't still considered addictions in the
by some
psychiatric Bible, like whatever, that is purely descriptive and it changes every 10 years, like
right.
whatever.
So this came
these
up
are
all the time,
addictions. Like everything I know as a scientist, these are addictions. The issues
I can tell you the
that
solution
described.
was the same, right? I was in a program, they call it anonymous, so no one puts their name out there. So I won't name the actual program, but it was a recovery for people struggling with sexual addictions. There are a number of different ones. I was in one of them, and it was copy and paste of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Just one word change. Instead of saying we're struggling with alcohol, we're struggling with sex. I mean, that's all. So the solution was the same.
Right. All the real patterns are the same. Telling yourself a million times, I know this is an issue, I got to stop, but still struggling, still. And your description, what kind of struck home with me is that, whether it's smoking, whether it's sexual addictions, you name it, it's like whenever you're still having that, I think of the old cartoons. I try to, I'm a pretty simple guy, I get into the highfalutin science, but sometimes it just comes down to these simple things, these analogies, the old cartoons with the devil and the angel on your shoulder. It's like, come on, just have one more. Just do this, go to the strip club, have the cigarette, whatever it is. And it's like, oh no, you've really told yourself that's not the right thing to do, and you have to be on there's a better way, and for these important reasons. Whenever that argument is still happening, you're still in it.
Correct.
You're still, as soon as you find yourself tempted, it's the game, whether it's right then, you might stave off that that urge, but it's going to get you at some, and you're still in the addiction, even if you haven't used for a long time, because you're still fighting that. And one of the things that psychedelics can prompt is something that you see with all of these addictions outside of psychedelic treatment. And you could see it with heroin, with cigarette smoking. There are times where it may be the 1,000th time they've tried, but there are times when I think of it like the tectonic plates of the psyche shift, and someone knows that they're done. Like it hits their soul like so deeply,
Yeah.
and like they realize they've reached a step. And a really good book on this by a great psychologist, not focused on psychedelics at all, but by Bill Miller, um, uh, wrote this book about quantum change, how people in science, we focus on incremental change, and that's what we know how to do. And, sometimes it works, a lot of times it doesn't. But in the world, and when he did survey research around, it's not uncommon, but it's filled, the religions and the story, the literature, Scrooge, Christmas Carol, the transformation, Saul on the road to Damascus. These stories of radical transformation happen, and there's real life examples of this stuff happening. And it may be the 1,000th time, and even something like heroin, cigarette smoking. He gave an example in his book of this guy struggling to quit, or he was. I don't think he was even struggling, but he was picking up his little daughter from school or daycare in the I guess it was school, and it was a rainy day. He was in the car, and he was there a little early, and he reached for his pack of cigarettes. Oh, I'm out. I'm gonna, store's up the road. I can go grab a pack and be back. And he started to drive away, and just as he was driving away, he sees his daughter come out of the school.
Oh,
And for just a split second, he told himself, I didn't see that. I'm just going to keep going. And he caught himself.
right.
It's like, my God, I was going to leave my daughter in the rain.
For a pack of cigarettes.
Done.
Right.
Sometimes it takes something like that to the universe to reflect yourself and you see it from a certain lens. And this is like, that was a psychedelic experience, I would say. Right. That was this radically different view of reality, a useful view of reality that just hit so deep and connected to the core of who he was that there was no going back.
That got to change. Right.
It's like, no, it's clear now. It's my daughter or cigarettes. And once you really put it that way, there's no competition. The devil and the angel are gone. Like, no, we're not arguing over, whether you love your daughter or not. Like, boom.
Right. The denial has been shattered. It's over.
Yeah.
I think about, for me, like what that impetus was. It was the recognition that there were, like I kept upping the experience. And then I had this, what I call a top shelf experience. When I share my story, I had this top shelf experience, which was, something with two sexual partners at the same time. And I did that. And it was always this experience that gave me this tremendous sense of peace. And I kept it there saying, okay, if I'm really in a rut, that's where I'm going. And I did it, and it did nothing for me. And I was like, wow, it felt like this stale pornographic material that I watched and needed to change out. And that thought of what's next, like where do I go to from here? And just all the possibilities. I was like, okay, this can get really dangerous really fast. And I just said, I'm done. I'm absolutely done. And that was the end, which sounds like a surprising. There are people who've gone to prison for their addictions and they haven't changed their mind about it. They've come out and done the same thing. But this was something internal that just said, oh my goodness, I'm chasing an endless path.
And there's something about, like, you had if I'm hearing you correctly, this part of the insight was into the future. Like, it's not just doing this thing right now. I'm on a path.
Correct.
And this is where, like, what is it?
It never ends.
5 partners, 10, like, what's it going to take next week or a year from now? And it's not going to get better. And I'm still going to ultimately feel like crap.
Correct.
In this recognition that just, like, it's this path. It's like one of my participants in the smoking research said she had a vision where it was actually this kind of, she said it was like the Andy Warhol, like the 1,000 pictures of the Campbell soup, that kind of iconic, or the Marilyn Monroe's, like the repeating, iconic images, the Andy Warhol style. And she said it was like I saw myself smoking a cigarette in and then it blew out, and then there was like 4, and then there was, it just kept expanding, and then there were like
number
a
of cigarettes.
million. And she realized, like, one of the things that kind of, the boring old talk, cognitive behavioral therapy to help people quit smoking that we give them before, well, it's not about the cigarette or not, it's about being a smoker versus not. And she said it just hit home. It's not about it's this cigarette versus not. It's about a million cigarettes versus no.
Right.
Like, do you want to smoke the next million cigarettes, 10 million cigarettes, or not? And like, sounds like you saw a vision of the future. You were aware of what path that was, going. And like, when you look at the path,
I'd
total
play back
package,
where it come
it's
from.
like,
Right, starting with catalogs, going to pornography, going from there to strip clubs, going from there to prostitutes, each one progressively more dangerous and risky. And then all of a sudden, like, wow, this is going to keep going. Where do I go? Where do I go to from here? So it's seeing the past and seeing the future and saying, I need off this path. I need a different way.
Big picture vision,
What?
that integration that in psychedelics in different ways can give people can see broader, I think, across different dimensions, whether it's socially, seeing how your connection to others, and whether it's across time, seeing yourself as this unfolding narrative in more of a clear way. And again, I said psychedelic experiences aren't just when you have a psychedelic. Like, you can have one of these aha, just insightful moments, this of clarity, where you kind of you have this overview look of your life, and you're like, hold on, I don't want to be doing that. Why am I doing that?
Right. It's fascinating. Yeah, I saw somewhere it's like compassion is not an absence of the truth. It's like a zoomed out vision or a zoomed out version, and you add more things into it, and that's true too. It's just more truth.
Right.
Again, kind of the same thing as a psychedelic. I see that. I've never heard it described that way. I like that.
Yeah. And I really like to focus on the sexual. I mean, I'm a strong advocate for this. I focused on sexual risk in terms of some of my research on other drugs like cocaine and alcohol, about how people get into where there's this interaction between substance use and sexual risk, where people would do things, including I developed models of asking people hypothetical questions like, would they have sex, this or that scenario, with or without, whether they'd use a condom. In situation, I found that like people on certain substances like cocaine and methamphetamine and alcohol, they're more willing to say, oh, even if they had to wait an hour for a condom, they just say, screw it. And they would,
if they're on the alcohol or if they regularly use alcohol.
If they're actually on alcohol. Actually, both are true. But what hadn't been done before, I really took a look at it, was that acute aspect, that it's not just a trait effect. It's not just this cumulative kind of group comparison. Well, people who use alcohol tend to engage in more risky behavior. It's and what a lot of people would say is common sense from experience. They say like, no, when you're drunk, it's not just this history. It's like, even for that person with that history, you do riskier things when you're actually drunk compared to when you're not, or when you're high.
So that's some
cocaine.
of what you studied. So that's some of what you studied, giving someone alcohol and then watching decisions that they make.
Yeah, you're doing things like we give them a selection of images of people and say, well, under a casual sex scenario, let's say met at a party, who amongst these would you, just on looks alone, would you be willing to have a one-night stand with? And then you kind of start from there and say, oh, if this is your partner, okay, let's say they want to have, how likely are you to use a condom with them if you have one? And then asking questions, well, what if you had to wait 5 minutes? What if you had to wait an hour? What if you had to meet up with them the next day, 24 hours later, because there's no condom? How likely are you?
And just asking them is enough? Asking them and getting responses is enough for a scientific study?
Yeah. So you do as much as you can to anchor that, because obviously there's some ethics involved. I don't want to make those real choices for people, but you see that it's tightly correlated with real life sexual decisions in a variety of ways. The data, there are patterns in the data that kind of look and smell like what we would expect from how people treat a delayed, consequence. So for every opportunity to validate, to look like, do you see higher propensity of this risk taking in this model compared to, standard, more accepted methods of assessing whether someone engages in sexual risk behavior, you see, it's well correlated. And so every way to kind of validate it, you do see. And in other research with other kind of rewards, like monetary or
that you could actually give in the moment.
Yeah, where that has been done. And I've done some of that research. You compare like delayed rewards for like, the $10 now versus $50 in a month. You do that under real and hypothetical conditions. I've done research like that, and you get the same answer. So,
Really?
Yeah. The people are very good at telling you hypothetically what they would do, because the decision is actually real, even though the consequences are. And brain imaging studies, fMRI studies, have shown that when you compare real versus hypothetical choices in scenarios like this, that the same brain areas light up. And when they make the short-term decision, I'll take the smaller amount of money now, that you see the same sort of the limbic structures, the reward centers are more so lighting up, active.
Got it.
And the more frontal lobe, the forethought and putting the brakes on areas light up when you're taking the larger later rewards. So there's a lot of research suggesting that these hypothetical methods are giving you a glimpse. They're a reasonable proxy for what people would do. So I bring it up because I focused a lot on sexual behavior, and I also have an interest in sexual addiction. And plenty of people have reached out, hey, do you have a study for, pornography addiction or sexual addiction, visiting sex work, you name it. And, like a lot of the stuff, unfortunately, no, but that's a great idea. And you don't know what to tell the person other than stay in professional help, seek professional help. We don't have a study like that right now, but it's definitely something that I would like to study in the future, because I'm very much of the philosophical and scientific viewpoint that it's arbitrary, whether it's a substance or some other rewarding behavior in the environment. Addiction is addiction. It doesn't matter whether it's ice cream or cocaine or pornography. It can all the same fundamental patterns emerge.
Yeah, I can tell you anecdotally, being in recovery meetings and seeing hundreds of people over the years come into those meetings, I would say there were 50-50 of the ways people got in. Some were, they got caught by their wife cheating on them, or some variation of something sexual on the outside that created a problem in their life, and then they made their way in. It was similar to my story. And then the others were people who were in a program, let's say like Narcotics Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous, another substance addiction. And as they were working with their sponsor or therapist, they recognized that underlying that was a sex addiction. And what I've seen many, many people is that they got their substance addiction under control, and their sex addiction was just this monster that they couldn't pin down, just much, much, much more difficult. So in terms of, I don't know what the science says about it being an addiction, but in terms of anecdotally and seeing a lot of people like this, is there seemed to be much more power in whatever was driving the sex addiction. Obviously, I'm talking from very biased view, people who are dealing with their sex addiction. But from these people, they got their alcohol addiction under control. They got their drug addiction under control. The sex addiction, they couldn't. It was something much more powerful there for them.
And I'm in the minority in terms of addiction scientists that I frankly think you have more insight than most addiction scientists in this regard, really at a fundamental level. Because again, these things aren't even formally considered, the way that the psychiatric Bible DSM defines them are substance use disorders. So even the nomenclature just implies that it can't be, they've gotten away from the word addiction. There's all these fads in science.
Do they say the same with gambling? Is gambling in the same category as sex? Because it's also a behavior. It's not a substance.
So I would consider it, again, like an addiction, but it's not considered an addiction.
Also,
I believe technically a compulsive disorder is how it's, but all of these things you can call compulsion. Compulsion to drink, do cocaine, use pornography, to gamble. But I would say the same thing there. All of the basic patterns emerge. And I've always been attracted to the science that really tells us what's in common across these addictions. Not, the difference isn't important. You get more, withdrawal with heroin than you get with cocaine. You have to be aware of these, differences, especially if you're talking about helping people. And there's a different landscape. Obviously, tobacco is very different than, alcohol and other, but in terms of the addiction itself, the struggle, it's the same phenomenon.
Yeah, that.
And I'm in the minority with when it comes to that, you know, in terms of, and so that doesn't limit to the, you know, you know, the substances, you know, and these same patterns emerge again, even in pigeons and rats, like the basic behavioral research of how organisms will defect on their same, you know, you ask a pigeon, and you don't talk, but
Right.
you, through behavioral preparations, giving them choices, you ask it whether it prefer like a larger amount of grain or a smaller amount of grain, and they're a little bit hungry, and that, you know, that decision is a minute ahead, you know, those consequences are a minute ahead of time. They'll take the larger one, but then as you bring those decisions closer and closer, they'll affect on their even pre-commitment. Even when they make a decision beforehand, you've given them the opportunity to defect on their own selves. They will do so,
So
just
how
like
do
a
you do that
person.
practically? Is it a distance that they have to get to?
Well, it's temporal distance is what I mean. So you set up, you know, where the two consequences are, you know, make up, you know, like, you know, 40 seconds now versus, you know, 50 seconds from now, which is a long time for a pigeon. And
But how can the pigeon understand what's coming?
well, but because you trained them through repeated trials where they
I see.
understand this
Oh,
scenario because
understood.
they've been in it dozens of times.
Like
And
kind of a Pavlov's dog where there's a
yeah, this type
bell
of
or something. Got it.
scenario where you
Okay.
really set and it's only through the animal getting used to the scenario. They know, oh, I'm here again. I know what these consequences are.
Understood.
And so, and then you wait till behavior stabilizes till it's pretty like, pretty much at some threshold, something like 90%. 90% of the time, and across that, this isn't changing now. They've kind of stabilized at, they've gotten enough experience. They prefer this thing. And then you kind of, with the same distance, temporal distance between them, let's say there's a 10 seconds delay, you bring it closer. It's like now this one's in 5 seconds and that one's in 15 seconds.
the
Now
decision will
they'll
change.
switch to the smaller sooner. And you can set up scenarios where even in the same trial, they will again have this opportunity to defect on. They've already made a choice for themselves. And it gets really complex. Pigeons will even make a choice to press a lever or peck on a key to make an option disappear that will tempt them to defect on themselves. So if a pigeon will say, you know, it's like, devil, get behind me. You know, it's like, I don't want you, I'm not going to go to the whatever strip club. I'm not going to put myself in
My version of
temptation.
not using an iPhone for a while.
Yes.
Right.
It's like, because if it's in my pocket, I'm probably going to be, you know, and so
Right.
I'm going to like put it on the other side of the room for the rest of the day.
Okay.
Even pigeons will do this same thing. They'll recognize, and I'm anthropomorphizing, but the behavior, the same patterns. They will say, I will make this response to make this other, you know, lever or response option inoperable. So because in the past when it has been, I know as time goes on, I'm going to defect on my own decision. I mean, it's just like if you're familiar with the Marshmallow experiments.
The 1 and 2 marshmallows?
Yes, the Walter Mischel experiment with little kids, and whether they're able to wait for the more preferred snack.
Yeah, you can go in detail on it just in case some of the listeners don't.
Yeah, so he did research decades ago on this psychological researcher on little kids and their ability to, and he studied different ages and different scenarios, but the basic setup is, will a little kid wait for this larger preferred reward? So whether it be 1 marshmallow, 2 marshmallows, or a marshmallow versus maybe a more preferred snack for that kid, maybe cookies is preferred over marshmallows. Like, well, you can have the marshmallow anytime you want to, but you know, they said they want to have the cookie, but I'm going to leave the room. And you don't know when I'm going to come back, but when I come back, you can have the cookie. But anytime you want to, you can just go ahead and eat the marshmallow, but then you're not going to get the cookie. And you look, and whether they wait or not is predictive of like SAT scores. You know, down the, I mean, when
Very
you take
scary.
like, you know, 6-year-olds and do this, it'll be, you know, predictive of their college entrance performance. And I believe now, you know, data even past that. It's like, and this is something it's not, we don't focus on it because it's not intelligence. It's independent from intelligence. This propensity to be patient seems to be a really important skill that underlies much of our functioning in the world. And kids will adopt strategies like without even scripting them. Like certain kids they'll turn around and
don't wanna look at
they
it.
figured
Right.
out that like I'm only gonna get through this if I turn around and just don't look at it. And some kids will say they have this like cognitively complex strategy of, I pretended it wasn't a marshmallow. I pretended it was a fluffy cloud. Sort of that I'm pretending it's something else.
Oh, so they'll tell you afterwards what they did.
Exactly. And so he's sort of unpacking, like, how did you get through that? And so,
And is there, I don't remember the study, but it's like as it went longer, they were more likely to eat it.
right.
And he always gave it open-ended? It wasn't saying, hey, I'll come back in 5 minutes and you get more. It was always...
He did variations, so I don't want to. It's been a while since I've looked into the particulars,
Right.
so I remember he did lots of variations. So I believe
Is that
like
something
varying
that could
time.
Is that something that could be taught? Meaning if you're saying that a
Yes.
6-year-old is predictive of their SAT score, then I kind of want to figure out with my 4 and 3-year-old and 2-year-old
Right,
how to
which
teach
is
whatever this is.
which is why teaching stuff like you name it, gardening, learning any skill like taking karate, jujitsu, playing chess, like anything where it's not instant. It's not Instagram, it's not TV, but things that require like the rewards come in slowly, but they're much bigger rewards. Like you work on this thing and now you can play the piano. You couldn't
Right.
do that the first day, but now you can play a song
So
because you've been
teaching
working on it a
kids-
few months.
So teaching kids those kind of things are more likely to get them to have that delayed gratification, which can set them up for a much better life.
Right. And that's drawing from, I mean, we do know that in like simpler ways that you can study more quickly in the laboratory, that you can teach some of these skills and that you can make people more patient. And you can even teach pigeons to be, again, all these same patterns emerge. You can teach the pigeons to be more patient by giving them experience with waiting for a longer, later reward. So, the more you can, in terms of raising human beings, I think about this with my 6-year-old, the more I can get him involved with things that are long and drawn out. The rewards come over time. You develop relationships, you develop skills. Those are theoretically setting them up to have this more general trait of patience in life, being willing and probably less likely to fall into an addiction and other things that we may not call addiction. Like say you struggle with your a violent temper, and whether even just yelling at a loved one, getting arguments with your spouse, saying things that you then regret later, and you need to tell yourself, I did it again, I flew off the handle, and I said this harmful thing to someone I love that I regret. And that's like I'd say that's an addiction. If it's something you're struggling, you regret, you recognize afterwards, like I did it, I shouldn't have done it, but I also did it last week and I told myself I wouldn't do it again, and I did it 2 days before that. Like that's an addiction. And so I think the less likely you are to fall prey to these immediate, that would be really good to tell this person what I really think and hurt them. I mean, that's an immediate reward, the same way that the cocaine or the sexual gratification or the ice cream or the TV, so the more you can kind of fill their behavioral economy with these kind of extended reinforcing relationships, which
Right.
sounds like a nerdy way of saying, but there's a very human side. Part of that
Yeah.
is developing relationships with people. Yeah, you treat your friends well and they'll treat you well over time. And if you're a jerk, they're not going to want to play with you. That's really, really, that's probably the most important thing.
Right, in the moment, you may have your toy, but in the long term, you won't have a friend.
Right. And frankly, I worry way more about, I'm focused way more on that with my kid than I am with, I'm concerned about their math and verbal skills, but I'm really happy that I hear from the teacher, like, yeah, he gets along with his classmates. He doesn't, he's fitting into that social matrix and not kind of doing these things. He's had little friends that have been on the more impulsive side and have, hitting their friends and hogging the tour. And, there's a spectrum. Of course, all kids are going to have that selfishness, but relatively speaking, I mean, that's probably the most important thing that kids are learning in school, especially like in elementary school. Probably far more important for life success than their math and verbal skills, I would guess.
Yeah, especially considering there's Excel. No, I'm kidding.
What's that?
I said, especially considering there's Excel and now ChatGPT.
Yeah,
My
exactly. You don't need to learn any of that stuff.
my
That's all automated. ChatGPT is not going to help you be patient, probably. Not yet.
my 4-year-old son the other day says, he's like, when is my birthday? His birthday's on June 2nd. How many days to my birthday? Can you ask Siri? And then he says, what did ChatGPT say?
Compare the response. It's like playing like mom versus dad. Like, I'm going to take the most favorable response.
Right. Let's see what they say. Can do your birthday early according to ChatGPT. I'm curious, according to the study of the marshmallow, how this would match with, the concept of a drug of choice in addiction. So someone may really go after cocaine, but something like marijuana may not do it for them. They may enjoy it, but it doesn't give them that same addiction. So how this would match up with the gratification idea, right? So if you measured me back 10 years ago on something sexual versus something like wine, which I may enjoy, a glass of wine, but there wasn't that addiction to it, you'd get a very, very different result.
Right. So there's evidence for both. Again, I've been more focused on those commonalities, but there's definitely a difference. We have different biologies, and I think that's a part of it. And part of it may be early, early development that might push us. We need more research into this. We certainly know there's a huge connection between early abuse of a variety of types and very hardcore addictive behavior. It's not a perfect correlation, but there are, and part of it might just be plain genetics. Hey, cannabis might make someone just like really paranoid, even though they have no moral quality. They like tried it plenty of times. They're just like, I'm all for whatever, giving it a try, but they just say it just freaks me out and it's not enjoyable, especially in any social situation.
Right.
Or cocaine makes them
right.
Cocaine, actually, most people who try it like it. It's an interesting. Opioids are like, this might surprise a lot of people. A lot of people try, whether it's heroin, whatever. A lot of people try opioids, including like medically, and things medically like morphine, fentanyl. I mean, same exact family as heroin, etc. Where they're like, their conclusion is, why do people like this? It just makes me feel slightly queasy and not normal. People who are social drinkers, it's alcohol, are far more likely to enjoy an opioid high compared to people who are teetotalers that don't drink much or drink at all. And so now something like cocaine, far more people will enjoy it if they try it, but not everyone goes off the rails. But there are these, to get back to your question, there are these individual differences for a variety of reasons, probably some just straight up genetic, that someone is attracted more to sedatives, someone's attracted more to stimulants. And there's plenty of people that are attracted enough to both, And so, but there's always something out there for you, like your example with, someone that they had a problem with the substance, but now they've channeled it into the sexual stuff, has gone off the handle. Like, there's always something. Never assume it's about that one thing, because maybe opioids aren't your thing. Okay, great.
Yeah,
so
take it away and you'll find another place.
There's going to be something else you're into. So it really is something deeper, like this deeper narrative about one's life, about this choice of them going down a path and this vision of is this who I am? Does this align with what I find meaningful in life? And from a behavioral perspective, it's like that's just the extended behavioral economy. Like, I'm on this path that's leading to all this stuff. Like, I really value my relationship with my wife, and this is a threat to that. I really value being a good example for my kids and hope to be alive when they graduate from high school and college, and maybe one day, maybe I'll have grandkids. I want to be alive for all that. All of these things, that this constellation of consequences that are it's really more about that. That's what I view as the heart of addiction. And again, there may be differences in what people are attracted to, in terms of what reward, what reinforcement might
but the
fill
underlying
that
angst
void.
is very similar.
There's this existential. Actually, my first participant in the smoking cessation research with psilocybin put it this way: it's an incessant need. It's a human thing. This incessant need, like you're never satisfied. And it's kind of the human and maybe the animal condition. I just think of, plants, their strategy is like put roots, put your solar panels up and collect your energy. Animals are doers. We got to forage around. We got to eat something else that's alive in order to live. We've got to go do our thing. We got to, find the food. We got to avoid the predators, whatever it is. And in humans, of course, that's where we come from, and we're doers as well. It seems like there's always this thing, like we're not complete, like we need to do something and I think for the human, it can be existential, like this need, to kind of quell that anxiety of that we're aware, unlike the other animals, that we are temporary, we're going to die. So
is it almost like what are we doing here? Like this need to answer that question almost.
I think so. And this goes certainly beyond the science. Let me be clear about this. This is kind of mixing what I know about science with philosophy in terms of just what I think is going on. So I can't support it with all the studies. No one can. But I really do think it comes down to there is something very existential about addiction in people, that there's a void that for everyone needs to be filled. I mean, we grow up being these little people that know less than all these big people around us, and we spend all these years being told you got to follow the rules, you got to get with the program, and then we plug into a society with all these expectations, and then even if we know it when we're kids and we get to an age, we realize like, oh gosh, I really am going to die at some point. And it's a heavy burden, and then confronting the unfairness in life, the horrors that can be in life, and you could read about it in history and see it on the news, and then, experience it. If you live long enough, you'll experience some of it yourself, like that. You can take as negative view as you want to about life, and you could view the human as a horrible creature and just life is nothing but, my philosophical stance is like that kind of defines everything. The fact that there is beauty and pursuit of truth and love, despite that background of having crawled out of the dirt and having this kind of, like that's what it's all about. It defines it. It actually is the reason that it makes it's the transcendence of that kind of makes it all meaningful to me personally.
There's a quote that the most important decision you'll ever make is whether the world is mostly friendly or mostly hostile. Is that?
Yeah, in fact, there was this guy that did this research. It's been somewhat controversial and second guessed, but I think the basic point stands that like he figured out, things like cocaine and morphine aren't so addictive in rats when you give them a playground and give them like litter mates and running wheels and cardboard tubes to run down. Like he called it a rat park. And when you give them that, their consumption of
they can ignore the cocaine.
They'll use it like a 20th of the amount that they would when they're stuck in basically solitary confinement for a rat. You're in a cage by yourself. The floor is not even soft. You're standing on wire, and there's one source of enjoyment. Well, you can sniff your rear end and or press this button. You can get an injection of cocaine. It's like, yep, I'm going to sit there and pound away at that. So, and one of his takeaways philosophically was that, it kind of comes down to whether you view the world, very much like you said, whether you view the world as a playground or a prison. And I really view it, that's a struggle.
Right, that is. And depending on someone's experiences, that may be harder or easier to arrive at. Yeah.
And I think when we look at those moments in our life where we do feel connected and filled with meaning, we are kind of looking at the life as a miracle or a playground. I mean, I think of one guy who was we did a study of people with cancer-related end of life or potentially end of life. They weren't necessarily terminal, but it had to be very life-threatening. Some were potentially terminal or very much terminal. And this one, he was actually a psychologist himself, worked in industry. He was an industrial organizational psychologist, but he just filled with tears the next day. And this is what always impresses me.
What was his study with them?
It was using psilocybin to help them with the anxiety and depression surrounding their cancer. And he just
So
said,
these are terminally ill people who know that they're
right,
that they don't have long
right,
to live,
or at least potentially terminal. It has to
correct?
be life-threatening enough, and
So that was the whole that was the whole group. Everyone you studied
yeah,
is in that
51
category.
people in that study, and we
You're giving them
studied
all psilocybin.
Yeah, we gave
First
them
experience of their life, was there a certain?
a good chunk. Some had psilocybin experience, but if they had psychedelic experience, it had to have been many years ago, and it had to have not been very meaningful for them. So
Understood.
some people, it's like, yeah, they tried it once in college and they giggled, and that's all they have to say about it, and that was fine. But I'm forgetting the percentage, but I think it was most had not used.
And were they experiencing? Were the 51 people all experiencing depression? Maybe some were already.
Yeah, so there's the limits of the psychiatric Bible, the DSM. There should be, but there's no disorder called existential distress. Actually argue there's evidence like SSRIs are even less effective than in standard major depressive disorder. But they all had to satisfy one of several predefined disorders that involved either depression, anxiety, or both. And the way it shook out is about a third satisfied disorders associated with depression, about a third satisfied disorders associated with anxiety, about a third both. But even if you don't meet, diagnostic criteria, like you meet all of the check marks to get this diagnosis, like depression was elevated.
They were all
pretty
struggling.
much everyone, yeah. And
what were the results of the?
Oh, dramatic reductions and down into the normal range on average. With 6 months later, most people in remission, not showing evidence that they would have any disorder, and this one individual.
And everyone was one experience.
One high dose experience. So the control condition, and they were separated by a month, was they had a trivial dose. More so we could truthfully tell people, you're going to have 2 psilocybin sessions, although at least one will be high. Both could be high, could be a high and a medium, could be a high and a low. In truth, so that was a realistic range of possibilities, but in truth, everyone got a high dose and a trivial dose that was probably so low that
they didn't feel
it's
it.
What you would call a microdose these days. It was kind of before the microdosing was a thing. And we didn't have a true placebo. This was like about 1 milligram. So we didn't have a true placebo to compare it to, so we couldn't really evaluate it as a microdose. But so essentially one high dose experience.
And 6 months later, you're seeing improvement across
dramatic. Everyone. Yeah. And then our colleagues at NYU, who published at the same time as us, they came out with a follow-up paper with the people that survived 4 to 5 years later, and found, amongst those people, virtually unchanged results. So it really
So what more is needed after you have studies like this and you have people struggling like that? What more is needed as a society to say, okay, if someone's end of life, terminally ill, give them psilocybin? What more is needed than these 2 studies?
So the FDA would need to approve it, and that's a little bit of an extra challenge because this isn't a disorder that's defined already, even though it is a problem. So actually, the early folks that were interested, that we essentially handed off our research and helped, for example, the USONA group, that's a nonprofit developing psilocybin for depression, they were initially considering this cancer indication, but then realized, we could help a lot more people with depression if that's feasible. So it was a little bit more of a risk. So let's see if this works for just straight up depression. And then, a good chunk of these people with cancer would qualify for that if it's approved. So
did it help the cancer in any cases? Did you measure that?
We weren't set up to look at that because, frankly, it was so hard to recruit, and we had to get people of a variety of different types of cancer, which really, from the folks that, even though it was really devastating to their life in terms of the impact, that in terms of prognosis, it was pretty good. And even though there was a chance it could come back and do them in, to people that, we knew, wow, it's a real gamble whether they're going to be around for the 6-month follow-up. And sometimes they weren't. So there was, and they different types, everything from bone cancer to, skin cancer, just such a variety and a relatively small, and 51 is pretty big for the psychedelic studies that have been done, but for looking at something that would be an indirect effect, that would be more of a psychosomatic effect, I bet you would get it, because we know enough about the nature of psychosomatic medicine that you change someone's outlook, positive outlook, you can affect actual measurable medical outcomes. I think you would need more like several hundred people to be able to show that. And you'd need a tighter study, like we're just going to study bone cancer, for example.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, it'd be
and
very
we
difficult
need like 200 people. And then, you know, so we weren't, but I think in the future that's a possibility. The one thing about this guy that made me go down this road with cancer is that the playground versus the prison thing. I mean, he just, the next day, he was just like in tears saying, "This like life is this miracle," and it's just crazy. We forgot it. It's like he's like I came here and walked down the street and it's like there's this tree and it's like this is an absolute miracle. What in the world is happening here? And there's all these other beings, human beings that like have like. It's such a deep, and it makes you sound kind of like an idiot, you know, like, well, what do you mean?
But it's a happy
there's
idiot.
trees and there's people. Yeah, but
Yeah.
it's just like this deep, like realization. Like if you just popped into this reality out of nowhere, it's like, whoa, this is mind blowing. That we are living in a miracle. You can do whatever you want. I mean, maybe not,
Right.
I can't fly, but like I can, you know, I can go up to people on the street and say, how are you? I want to get to know you. Like you could like,
This
I
is
want to
pretty
learn
cool,
to
what
play
we're
the
doing right here.
violin. Like it's like, it's a playground. What do you want to do? And especially these days and you know, in a country like this and in modern times and, you know, but yet so many people feel like, oh gosh, you're locked into this. Like it's a job you don't like. And these patterns that are, you know, you're into whatever it is, you know, these various addictions, and you just feel like life is just a prison. Despite the fact, like sometimes you change that perspective and you look and realize, I mean, just miraculously, like, wow, look at what we can do. Like, just to be alive, like that's weird.
Did you sit with these 51 people?
No, but I talked with all of them before and after. I have guided dozens of sessions. In that study, I was a guide for some of them. So when I'm forgetting how many, probably 6 or 7 maybe in that study.
What's that like?
Oh, those have been some of the most meaningful. Probably have learned more. I have learned more than the actual, you know, the statistics and the publishing the papers and crunching the numbers, that side of things. I mean, I've just met so many people that I've learned from, you know, that are facing, you know, death. And some, I mean, like the gentleman I just spoke about, and really all of these studies where I've served as a guide in these sessions. These are, it feels, I mean, sometimes I actually was telling a friend this just last night on the phone that if I'm hit by a bus tomorrow, at least, you know, that's one of the things that I can, you know,
Feel good about.
yeah, like I really helped. I mean, it wasn't because of me. I was a part of something bigger, but I really helped set the stage for like these beautiful, important moments for people. Transformations that helped them touch base with their humanity and that affected their families. I mean, there were families that reached out to us after the cancer study that said it just transformed the last several months of their father's life. And you just think, oh, this is someone in their 20s. Their entire matrix, their memories of their father are going to be transformed.
You're saying it's not
70 years from now, like if they're still alive.
It's not just the 51 people, it's the right.
And I wish we had done a better job studying that, because the older research papers from the 60s said that. It's like, whoa, the transformations in the families were absolutely mind-blowing. I'm paraphrasing, but like we should have studied them, you know, because it really, like, you just transform these. I mean, I think of a guy about 30 years old dying of pancreatic cancer. You know, he wasn't going to make it. It was bad, you know, with like these little kids, and had never had that conversation about what was happening, and then to have that open up, and you just realize like this is really affecting people. And like those, those kids are probably going to remember
Right.
like these heartfelt conversations about the dad in the right way, letting them know what's happening, that he's going away, and how important that probably is for people going forward.
Yeah, it's huge. I'm thinking about my own experiences and coming back home from Costa Rica, and my wife starts telling people about how ayahuasca is amazing. And someone says, "Well, have you done it?" She says, "No, but my husband has, and he's completely different."
Yeah.
And she saw it more than me. I felt, obviously, certain changes, but it was her observations that made it more real for me.
Yeah, and in some of our research, we have gotten so-called community observers. There's always a way to make something sound like really boring in science. Community observers. The spouses, the partners, the coworkers, the friends of people that have validated. Because are these people just are they full of themselves? They think, and there are anecdotes of that I think are real. Sometimes I get people to reach out. They say like their son has gotten all off the rails with psychedelics, and their ego is huge, and they talk about being enlightened, but they've alienated themselves from their whole family, and they think they're holier than thou. And you do get an impression like, yeah, you can take this in the wrong direction, and if it's not well grounded, it's sort of that you can be deluded. And who knows? There's a lot to figure out there. It might be personality type. It might be the setting. It might be that kind of backdrop of the messages they're getting. It might be frequency related. We don't know. I've known folks that have done psychedelics hundreds of times that seem to be off the rails, but I've also known ones that have done psychedelics hundreds of times that are some of the most genuine, heartfelt, grounded people that I know. So it's a tough equation to figure out, but it does seem that there can be this self-delusional, and it's been called spiritual bypassing, that you think you've gotten this message and you're sort of running with it, but it's kind of ungrounded. I think of Ram Dass. That was actually one of my early, reading Ram Dass in college was part of what kind of made me interested in psychedelics. And in his book, Be Here Now, there's a page, and there's beautiful artwork in that book, which is really cool. But I'm imagining he's saying, it's one thing to the difference between how did he put it? The mystic and the crazy person is like, the mystic has a vision that, let's say he's the Buddha, he's the Jesus, but the mystic also recognizes that everyone else is too. And the crazy person doesn't get that second part. It's sort of like that ungroundedness, like when you think it's
right.
In one sense, it is just about you, but these are realms where like words fall apart, but it's the most personal, experience possible, but it has to be grounded in the sense that like, everyone else is going through this journey of life as well, and you're not above, you are the same. And it's like, it's grounded if you consider yourself a part of whatever your model is, if, the divine, that, well, so is everyone else. And maybe that's a part of the grounding that some people don't get.
Yeah, I've certainly seen it as kind of a temporary space for certain people, maybe having one or two experiences and then going into that space, and then over time that evening out. But I'm sure that's not for everyone, but I have seen it, but I've seen it with people who do yoga too.
Absolutely. And oh gosh, meditation, it really is like, we as a society, we're primed to like see and remember the negative experiences with drugs, substances. But there's a whole and there's a bit of science on it, essentially bad trips with meditation, and people that talk about hey, they can't take a warm long bath now because they kind of go into this space that and they're a good meditation teacher's like, you need to take a break for a while, like you're accessing states of being that you don't have the stability right now to access, and you need to kind of more work on any homework you've gotten from those experiences, right? Same with psychedelics. So rather than going back to that.
That's a question I want to ask you. In the psychedelic community, they talk a lot about integration and the importance of that in order to ground the experience and get the benefits of it. Do you find that in the research as well, that it wasn't just a psilocybin experience, but did you do something with those 51 patients before and after beyond an interview that helped to
Absolutely.
ground the experience?
So there was 8 hours of preparation.
Oh, wow.
And so that's over several meetings.
And preparation in terms of like psychologically what they're dealing with?
Yeah, both discussing them. So some of it is what we would do for any psilocybin study. So the way I formalize it is, and I made a manual for the smoking research to make it formal, to make sure we cover these things. But talk about their life, their history, their childhood, their current life. So their loved ones, romantic and otherwise, both their family of origin and their current family, if any, and I mentioned part of that being their romantic life, but their whatever they do for a living, whether it's taking care of kids, whether it's a job of this nature or that nature, and then how they orient towards the big questions. And I use that because I'm a very strong advocate of, at least as a secular, profession, I'm not telling any, church what to do, the psychedelic, the Native American church, the UDV, et cetera, or indigenous communities, but you kind of bring people this experience where they face the big questions, like don't fill in the blanks for people. Some people view it all through a materialist, scientific, whatever lens. Some people talk about different dimensions. Some people, speculate about aliens, and some people will be, and you name the religious faith, there are people from the, whatever it is. Some people.
So for those guiding them before, during, after, not to influence,
really let them, but you're also not there to say, no, that wasn't,
right.
That was just, the serotonin 2A receptors being affected in your brain. It's like, yeah, you can't say whether that was an experience of God or not.
Right.
And I don't think it's our job to bring up, but it's also not our job to admire, it's used reflective listening and let them guide. I told the participants, when you have an experience like this, you are the world's expert on those philosophical questions. No scientist on the planet can tell you, was that an experience of other dimensions? Was that an experience of God, of this nature, that nature? But I do think is important, because people touch on those big questions, to like at the beginning, like, what is your worldview? Well, and you could be Richard Dawkins, style atheist. You could be of whatever, and all of it's welcome. There's no judgment. Just to touch base on how do you view? So I think that's kind of part of it, because I want to know where they're coming from, should they have a profound experience of whatever type. And you kind of want, this is an intimate thing, and I want them to be totally free no matter what is, and you prepare them. So part of it is going through those things, but also then part of it for the cancer studies, obviously discussing their history with cancer and what they've been struggling with. How they view it,
their perspective. Got it.
Yeah, like what their struggle has been like, and that just touches on so many things, their family, and what they've wanted to do in life, and fears that, of the pain of death, or their belief in the afterlife, whether they believe in the afterlife, what, some fear around that. All of that, you prepare people. Then the session day itself is really, guiding is kind of a misnomer, because it's more of, you're there as more of a safety net. It's like a good session. You're checking in every half hour. So how you doing? Oh, I'm doing fine. Okay.
Like a physical safety net.
Yeah. Like if they have anxiety, about at a high dose, about a third of the people will have what could be called a bad trip out there. In this context, I say it's a challenging experience, because most people who have very scary experiences end up seeing that as part of their healing journey. They drew lessons from it. It's like they ran the gauntlet of, and it's like, even if they felt at one point that they're going to die, it's like they can come out the other end, especially if you're talking about something like, cancer, dealing with the fear of cancer and death. Like, that could be very therapeutic. It's like, wow, I went through an experience where I didn't physically die, but I really thought I was going to die, and I went through and it was okay.
Right, so a bad trip would suggest an unproductive trip. You're saying it was difficult, but...
Right, and the really bad thing, and it happens, and it was overblown in the propaganda in the late 60s, early 70s, but the really bad thing is, like, going, freaking out, getting naked, running across the highway and getting hit by a truck. I mean, again, or jumping from a height, which very rare, but it has happened. These are really reality altering.
So what do you do to
substances.
protect from that in the studies?
To protect them from that? Well, you keep them in a safer, one, you prepare them. So that really doesn't guarantee that a challenging experience won't happen, but the frequency of certain types of experiences, such as extreme paranoia of the guides, that's very rare. And I think that's a tribute to the preparation work. So the rapport building. I mean, you let them know, like, this may be the most frightening experience of your life. And I tell my participants, I've had multiple vets that have told me this has replaced combat as the most intense experience of their life. So you can't overstate. I've never been in combat. So, I mean, that's just above, you know.
For
so
people
I'm
who say
humbled by that.
It's a shortcut or something easy. I mean, you have a combat veteran saying this is the most intense. Yes.
And so you prepare them for that, and you say you might be. And one of the differences with recreational use is, hey, you might have, dropped acid or taken shrooms at a party, and like you find yourself in the back, someone's bedroom at the house where the party's at, crying about your relationship with your mom. And it's like the next day, it's like, oh man, you were wigged out. Your friends tell you, it's like, man, you should have just had a couple of beers and chilled out. And it's like, no. Here, you're not supposed to be social. You're not one of like 5 friends that are doing this. It's like, this is your day. If you feel called to cry about your mother, that is exactly what you need to be doing. And those tears are like, let them pour. Let them pour. And we want you to feel comfortable. And that, or hysterical laughter and everything in between, it's all welcomed, and it's exactly what you should be doing. You're not putting up the social game of like, oh, this is going to look weird. This is embarrassing.
Right. So you're really preparing people for this.
Yeah. Like, you need to be able to let go as deeply as possible, even with the thoughts of like the music. You're not playing DJ. The music program's already selected. Your job is to be a baby and to just go inward. And we're taking care of everything else. If there's a fire alarm, like it's happened a couple of times in the studies out of hundreds of sessions, like, we'll take you outside. It'll just be where they don't get to see nature and outside, so we'll get to go outside and walk around the campus, and it'll be fine. But other than that, like and even there, we're going to lead you around like a baby. We're going to go out with you. So it's you're letting go of everything. You're not worried about hey, someone's taking a psychedelic, they're at a concert. They do need to be somewhat concerned about, oh, where's my wallet? Where's my purse? Especially for women, obviously, am I going to be sexually assaulted if I'm like inebriated in public? Like, you're not supposed to trust everyone. So you want them to feel like they're in an environment where they can let go of all that. And even something that's cool is at the level of, if you're in the U.S., even if it's very unlikely, the idea of like, yeah, the cops could bust in because this is illegal. Like, what if somehow they found out that, like, whatever. It's like, nope, this is DEA, FDA, they've all checked off. This is a controlled substance, but this is the legal use of a controlled substance. There's nothing illegal about this. So even at that level, I think of that as your tribe at large, the United States government, like your tribe has sanctioned this. Like, there is nothing wrong with this.
I would imagine a lot of people listening to this want to know, how do they get into a trial? How do they get a family member into a trial? Are there ones ongoing? Is there a way to get in?
The best thing to do is to look at there's a website called clinicaltrials.gov. And that there are now so many psychedelic studies, thankfully. I mean, gosh, up until 5 years ago, I could have told you, all the studies on the planet that were going on, especially when I got into this in 2004, almost 20 years ago. Then there were like 2 or 3 studies on the planet at any point in time. But there's way too many for me to even be aware of. I mean, there's hundreds at this point, I believe. But get on clinicaltrials.gov. That whether it's a government-sponsored study, like NIH-funded study or not, that is the repository in most institutional review boards, the ethics board at universities and other institutions, that you need to get that type of approval. That will require you to register in a place like that, and the FDA will, because you need FDA approval. So you can find all of the psychedelic studies, really most of them in the world, and it's not just limited to the U.S. Like, you can, that's the best repository of the ongoing psychedelic study. So look up for keywords like psilocybin, psychedelic, MDMA, and you can hopefully find something near you. But I do warn people, there's a far greater need than the bandwidth
Right,
that
for
the
sure.
clinical trials.
No, I
But
have no
we're
question.
probably less than a year away from MDMA being approved as a treatment. And we haven't talked about ketamine, but ketamine is approved right now. And some people do and don't consider it a psychedelic.
Do
I do
you?
consider it a
You do.
psychedelic. It's different. I mean,
Have you
they're
seen the benefits to be similar to?
yeah, there's a huge overlap. And I think in a lot of the clinics that are preparing for running MDMA and psilocybin sessions when that approval comes along.
They're starting with ketamine.
Exactly, exactly. And then there's other things, like there's the state law in Oregon.
I was going to ask you about Oregon. I have that question and one other, just because of time constraints. But on Oregon, what do you think about that? I mean, I saw the first, so in 2019, I think it was, or 2020, they passed a law that it's legal under certain, right? It could be like regulated in some way. And I guess the first clinic came out that's offering it. Do you feel like it was done correctly? Do you have any issues with it?
The jury is still out. I mean, we'll see how it goes. I mean, some of the things I was concerned about at the beginning, and I had told the organizers that, their intention was for it to not conflict with federal law, and until, psilocybin is taken out of the Controlled Substances Act, there's going to be some level of conflict. So hopefully there's, a tolerance at the federal level, which I think is going to be there, but it's not guaranteed. So, are we going to have the early days of medical cannabis, and like after Prop 215 in California, passed in 96, where, if you're politically active, like your dispensary or your clinic would be, rated by the DEA, whereas if you kept your mouth shut, and just did your thing, you'd be fine. So you get this selective enforcement, which is kind of a threat to the First Amendment. And not kind of, it is a threat to the First Amendment. Either it should be legal or not,
Right.
So you get this weird gray area where things might be in conflict with federal law. So I don't know the details of, or what assurances they have from the feds that this is going to be, I want to see the experiment unfold. I want to see things done safely. One of my concerns from the beginning was this was sort of sold in the ballot initiative as therapeutic use. But if it's therapeutic use, you do need to have certain standards. If you're treating disorders, so that kind of conflicted with, they had something in the, at least in their early, I'm not sure if it shifted, proposed framework that said, well, there's no educational requirements, as a nod to the indigenous cultures where, hey, you may not have a degree, but you might be from a society, from a lineage
Right, that's been doing this forever.
Yeah, and so that gets complicated, and I understand where that comes from, and especially acknowledging that so many of these traditions of these, things like mushrooms do come from hundreds of, if not thousands of years of indigenous cultural use. At the same time, if you're talking about, treating PTSD, we know some things about treating PTSD, like how to do it and some things that will make it worse. And I sort of think, like, well, if you're doing surgery, like, all respect for all cultures, but on top of anything else, I want to make sure you've gone to an accredited medical school and have surgical residency. It's like before you cut into me. So if you treat, so that's a bit of a concern. And so I think they've navigated that by, it's technically not for therapeutic use now. And
in Oregon.
Right. And so one of my concerns, though, is that, are they really vetting people? Like, we really screen people at the psychiatric and physical level. We give them a physical, test their heart, and their blood pressure and liver health, et cetera, getting a blood sample. And we do a structured psychiatric interview, really delving into their, which could take anywhere from an hour to several hours, depending on the length of their history. But is it going to boil down to a form, like you've shown up, you've already spent a couple $1,000s to even just get the, or hundreds of dollars for the flight, and you've paid the, and then you show up, you spend all this money, and you've taken time off of work and everything, and then they hand you this form, and this is a hypothetical here, but I wouldn't be surprised if it unfolds, and it's like, oh, check all that, if you have a family history of heart disease, blah, 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 and you just check no on everything, because, like, yeah, I don't want this thing to get canceled last minute. Or even if it was done at the beginning, where you haven't spent all the money, but you also realize, oh, if I check no to these things, if I check yes to this, I'm not going to get it. So, humans are humans. We tell little white lies sometimes, and thinking, well, if there's any risk, it's to me, and so I'll fib on this. So I am a bit concerned, like, what the standards are going to be. I hope that it's going to be done well. Like, if someone's really dealing with, like, serious trauma, like, you would need a clinical psychologist and or a psychiatrist to be, with training and helping with that disorder involved as an example. And I think for any of it, you need the appropriate, and I don't know where they've landed with this, but I think you need the appropriate physician involvement. You certainly don't need, it would be overkill to have a physician in every room. You would actually make this
too expensive.
Exactly.
It's already very expensive. It was $3,500 for
I saw that
experience,
yeah.
which is...
And it is expensive to get 2 trained professionals.
It's a lot of hours. A lot of hours of time.
Yeah, and that's not even counting preparation and integration, which is essentially discussion the day after, and then depending on, even in days following that. So, but like, if there's, like, how far are you from in case there is a bit of a chance. These, like, mushrooms are pretty robustly medically safe, but there is a bit of concern. There have been some people that have died that are at the severe ends of heart disease. The type of people who going up flights of stairs or shoveling snow or, frankly, having sex, these things send people to the ER every day, who are in that very vulnerable position. If your doctor told you, don't take the stairs at work, take the elevator because your ticker can't take it, you're at risk for anything that slightly elevates, even modestly elevates your blood pressure and pulse, like psilocybin. And so there have been, and they're very rare, one of the only, perhaps the only in the medical literature, death from mushrooms has been a heart transplant patient, obviously in that high risk, category. So, like, how far, just in case something happens, how far are you from, and I don't know where they've landed with that from medical, an ER in case you need it. Or, I did my undergraduate in Eastern Oregon, so I know what it's like. It's beautiful, but you can be in places that are like, you're 3 hours from civilization. You're in, God's country. You're just like natural beauty. But, like, if something went wrong, you'd be. So I don't know where they've landed with things like that. And was a physician involved with evaluating whether you qualify, I don't know where they've landed with that. But those are some of the things that
you worry about.
Yeah, and I'll also recognize there needs to be a balance, because you can't, if you make
if you make it too out of reach, then people who need it
right. So maybe it's like, hey, you had to get a signature from your own physician. You have to get a physical yourself, and we need to see that you're not that would be a reasonable compromise for me. It's like that you're not at that severe level of heart disease. And we've done plenty of people that are on beta blockers or controlled hypertension, and that seems to be totally fine. But yeah, so things like that, and people that are showing the signs of, there is good suspicion that people that are prone to disorders like schizophrenia, that they could be destabilized from this. So have you probed for that in a serious way, not just have you ever been told you have schizophrenia? So I want to see, I'm not an expert where they currently stand with all of that, but those are the things that would be on my radar screen. And I hope it's a success, because I'm all for, like, we live in a constitutional republic and federalism. It's like states can be experiments. It's like, hey, the rest of the country could look at this in a few years and say, we want to do that or we don't. And the feds can look at it and say, we want to do that or we don't,
Right. I hope it goes well, because anecdotally, and with myself and many others, I've seen a lot of promise for this. So I want to thank you for joining. First of all, nothing we said is medical or legal advice. Obviously, anyone who's researching this, go about it in your own way with your own professionals. But I do want to thank you both for coming here today and for the work you've done in this area. You're one of the early ones.
Thanks,
so thank
Ellie.
you so much.
I really appreciate what you do and having me. Yeah.
Thank you. Looking forward to more.
Yeah.